The history of institutionalized anti-Zionism throughout the diaspora has been campaigns of harassment of Jews and their occasional expulsion. The history is on the side of the Jews who are, quote unquote, hysterical, who are freaking out. And they have a right to be. And it's the work of leftists to engage with them with curiosity about that and know that history, which they don't seem to.
I'm Phoebe Maltz Bovy. You're listening to The Jewish Angle, a podcast from the Canadian Jewish News. So I wrote a column called Zohran Mamdani is not Nick Fuentes. I maintain that Zohran Mamdani is not Nick Fuentes. This column inspired a lot of people to write me privately to tell me that I was missing something here. And specifically to say that that for me to be writing as a Jew in a Jewish publication and not to be more concerned, or even to some I didn't seem concerned at all, a little concerned, but to some I didn't seem sufficiently concerned about Mamdani's candidacy and victory in the New York mayoral election. There were just a bunch of people writing me privately to say that I had missed the mark. This showed me that this topic was resonating for Jews, not just in New York City, which happens to be my own hometown, so I have some provincial interest in it, but also just beyond the United States. And Canadian Jews are clearly concerned about this topic as well. The nature of private communication is that I cannot run these as a counterpoint. However, I feel like if I know that there is a counterpoint that is strongly felt, I want to give voice to, if not exactly the people who wrote me privately, like to something along the lines of, what am I missing here? I don't want it to just be me holding forth. I want to, know what else is out there. And if Jews are concerned, why? If my fellow Jews are concerned, why? Because I think there are bits of it I get, bits of it I don't get as well. Rather than further going on this path of clumsy attempts at paraphrasing, I wanted to give a platform to someone who had already written something that was less upbeat, perhaps, than I was about this, but from a thoughtful perspective that I thought, would be worth platforming here. Which brings me to our guest today on The Jewish Angle, who is Josh Yunis. Josh, welcome to The Jewish Angle.
Thank you, Phoebe. It's great to be with you.
Thank you so much for coming on. Josh is a writer and director based in Los Angeles, and he writes the newsletter The Diaspora on Substack. He's a mutual of mine on social media, and I always find his posts insightful. And specifically, his newsletter that he called The Mamdani Sting really stood out to me among a really huge sea of opinion pieces about Jews and Mamdani's victory and what it all means. So rather than, I do encourage everybody to read the piece, but I do not assume that anybody listening has already done so. Josh, first of all, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit and just explain, you refer to yourself as being a leftist, a Jewish leftist. What is that, since all these terms, Zionism, leftism, all of these terms can mean any number of things, what does leftism mean to you?
I was a Bernie Sanders supporter in 2016 and 2020 and have been, I guess you'd call, anti-occupation in Israel. So the way that leftism intersects with the Israel-Palestine conflict is obviously very complicated and I think has been sort of misaligned over the last 2 years or longer. Leftism for me is a commitment to universal principles, primarily at its core, and about holding many different people and particularities and people with different particular backgrounds together in a coalition to advance social change and social justice. I've felt, and I'm sure that you can identify with this, and a lot of your listeners will, that over the last 2 years, there's kind of been a sense that the commitment to those universal principles has been selective and selectively applied on the mass movement left. So sometimes I ask myself, am I really still a leftist anymore? I think I am. I think I have definitely a newfound sense of skepticism about mass movement left-wing politics as it's kind of manifested itself over the last 2 years. Primarily on the question of what does it mean to remained committed to a set of universal principles. And so I don't think that, oppressed people necessarily get to define the right or just political outcomes simply by virtue of their oppression, right? I think that's something that many of us have been talking about for a while. And I think that applies equally to Israelis, Jews, Palestinians, Muslims, Arabs. And so that's kind of where I was coming from in writing this piece about Mamdani, but using it just as a kind of a way to speak about the larger issues in which I felt that the left hasn't remained committed to those principles.
Right. I think it's really important. The reason I wanted to draw you out on this is because some of the reaction to Mamdani has been from people who see the word socialism and panic, or whether panic may not be the word. Some people are just very principled against it, whatever. That's not where you are coming from in this piece. So what you get into in your newsletter, but I'd like to draw you out on also on this podcast, is what is it that makes it so difficult for you to voice your own ambivalence about Mamdani, sort of positionality wise? Like, what is it that people are saying about him that you are not saying about him, specifically about the thing where people are basically just sort of racist against him?
There's been a lot of that, and I think it's been really reprehensible. I think it came from Cuomo himself. I get fed like a sea on social media of like the most kind of crass and vulgar Islamophobic 9/11 material about Mamdani that I just find, to be morally outrageous, but also feels so old. Like it feels like the people making these jokes are living in a time that has left them behind, and it feels very, cringe, to borrow an internet word, in addition to being shameful.
What you're right so well about is that there's this tricky thing that happens, and I don't think that this is specific to Mamdani or indeed to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but it's just very much this online thing where, like, I don't know if you've come across this, but where you see debates sort of devolve where one person says, all these people are in my mentions, trolling me, hating me, trying to dox me, whatever, which proves my point, which proves that I'm right about the thing I was saying. And you want to be like, it's never okay to dox, to, troll, whatever, all of that's horrible. None of it means you were right about your whatever it was you happened to have said that sparked this. You know what I mean? And I think I saw a dynamic similar to that playing out here, where because there were some loud and prominent and also, less prominent voices who are just kind of Islamophobic and nasty, it made it that like that would be kind of brought up as like, and that's why Mamdani needs to win. And it's like, to a point in this case, I kind of get it, because like under Trump, like with that being the kind of zoomed out context this is all happening in, there is something to be said for just anybody who kind of sticks it to Trumpism in that way. But at the same time, there are a lot of things going on at the same time.
That's also what's taken as the objection to Mamdani or on any of these issues, right? Is like, let's hold up the most hateful and weakest version of this argument and lift that up as the kind of paradigmatic and only objection to Mamdani or to whatever the case may be, whether it's any other issue, like you said. And there's actually like a whole bunch of other objections that kind of get lost because it's not as fun to like quote retweet them and dunk on them,
I've been just so struck by how entangled things are or seem to be to these sort of purists who will see anything Jewish that has not, any person or institution that has not outright renounced Israel and Zionism in some sort of really purist way is tainted, and I'm talking about the sort of like boycott your local bagel shop type anti-Zionism. And I think that's sort of, well, I guess that kind of gets me to my more abstract part 2 of the question, which is, for me, something that did make me, not panic. And I genuinely don't know who I would have voted for if I were still living in New York, because I think it was a lot of choices I would have not been too excited about. And I might have voted for the free buses. I would not necessarily rule that out. But the fact that if I ever see somebody who is not Palestinian themselves, and they've picked as their main cause the Palestinian cause, and they've done so not at this particular moment in time when it's so ubiquitous, and like if you're just coming of age politically now, it's what's everywhere, right? I wonder. I'm like, oh, I don't know. And I'm not going to say that everybody who picks any particular cause is an anti-Semite, capital, whatever. But like, yeah, something about that, I wonder. And I know, like, if I were a 2010s, identity politics hot take writer, I'd be saying, well, he's a person of color, so it's different. No, I don't think it's necessarily different. He's not Palestinian, right? Paired with the fact that there's been this kind of glee that I've seen, not just from people in New York, sometimes from people in Canada, that like the old guard is going to go. Down with the old guard. I'm Jewish. I'm from New York. The old guard, I mean, my family is not in charge of stuff, but like they're Jewish and they've been there a long time. You know what I mean? Like, and there's this part of me that feels like I both, and this is the part I wrote about in my column, was like sympathizing with sort of Jews who've been in New York for a long time, who feel not displaced in a like replacement theory sense, but like they're one marginalized ethnic group who feels, like it's neither the gentrification story nor the, like, it's its own thing, right? But also, but what I didn't write about and probably should have is just like this sense that there just seems to be this glee in down with all that. Am I on to something?
That's really, I think, what spurred me to write this, which was that this sense of like just absolute euphoria about his campaign. And it's like, whatever you feel about it, I could not feel that sense of euphoria and the just absolute dismissal of Jewish fear or skepticism as something that was just hysteria. I read this piece by Shalom, which you quoted in your piece by Shalom Magid, about just like Jews are playing this game of Chicken Little, and they think the sky is falling. And I do want to be honest, I do think there are hyperbolic, like we've spoken about already, responses to Mamdani's campaign. But this kind of just hand waving away of any Jewish fear or concern, or the incredulousness that something might be unsafe for Jews, or that it's even a question worth asking, I just found to be really dishonest and disingenuous. And I think, to answer why, it goes back to what you were just bringing up. I think there's two things, right? The first is, I think, a real sense of what anti-Zionist anti-Semitism could be, which isn't to say that all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, but the track record is on the side of the Jews who are afraid about this. It's not on the side of the people who are saying anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, as if that ends the question. I mean, the history of institutionalized anti-Zionism throughout the diaspora has been campaigns of harassment of Jews and their occasional expulsion. So as I said in the piece, Mamdani has the opportunity to change that and to will something else into the world. But the history is on the side of the Jews who are, quote unquote, hysterical, who are freaking out. And they have a right to be. And it's the work of leftists to engage with them with curiosity about that and know that history, which they don't seem to. And I think a lot of Americans, including some American Jews, they just understand anti-Semitism as like Hitler, right? It's like Nazis, and they come and round you up and put you in a camp. And there's that's the exception to the rule. And there's this whole other history of forced conversion or assimilation, and harassment. And the fear is that, as you were laying out before, that people who don't conform to a definition of Jewishness that is defined for them by outsiders will be harassed or asked to leave polite society. And that's already happening. And, I loved the version of diaspora Judaism that existed in New York and in the US for the last 50 years, where we meaning Jews, could basically define ourselves on our own terms. And I think that's what's being pulled away from us. And that is anti-Semitism. When you're asked to, conform to a certain kind of Judaism if you want to be accepted into society, that is anti-Semitism. And it stings especially that it comes from the left that for so long has embraced identity politics and combated assimilation and celebrates the idea of self-definition. So it's especially painful to see it coming from that movement. And the other one is just not anti-Semitism, but just this sense of like euphoria that you were describing from his supporters, and just this feeling like it just feels like time and time again, the kind of Jewish fears and concerns and pain is really not being felt. And it feels like the kind of norm of, maybe there was for too long a kind of pro-Israel normative politics in New York and in the United States, but it would be bad if it's being replaced by a kind of like catch-all normative pro-Palestinian politics that kind of ignores any Jewish pain or suffering.
Ever since October 7th, 2023, Muslim and Jewish communities in Canada have been torn apart.
I've known you for 20 years. You've been at my house for Shabbat supper, I don't know how many times. And for 1 second, you can't put down your friend and just hold my hand?
We're fed a constant stream of Jews and Muslims talking at each other, about each other, but rarely do we hear them talking to each other.
There was, why are you doing this? What's the benefit of doing this?
This podcast aims to do something different. I'm Avi Feingold, a rabbi and a writer with the Canadian Jewish News.
I'm Yafa Sakeja, a Canadian-Palestinian entrepreneur and volunteer with the Canadian Friends of Standing Together.
We're sitting down with Jews and Muslims, Israelis and Palestinians from coast to coast and across the political divide, having difficult conversations in good faith.
We are not the Israeli government. Palestinians are not Hamas.
This is the place where we're both supposed to end up, Israeli and Palestinian, Arab and Jewish.
Subscribe to In Good Faith, wherever you listen to podcasts.
There had been this kind of understanding on the left of how to deal with minority groups, marginalized minority groups' sensitivities, right? And that if a group hears a dog whistle, to take that seriously. And also that just because you can find one or a handful, whatever, of people of some marginalized group who have a contrarian take or whatever, if you're listening to what that group says on the whole, you want to listen to what most people from that group actually think. Those had been these principles that had really guided, like what I call the long 2010s, like up to 2024, whatever. That had been the being sensitive. And here you see kind of both things flipped. So demographically, yes, there's this fuzziness coming from the nuns. I don't mean the Catholic celibate religious women. I mean the NONES, who in New York, probably a bunch are ethnically, culturally Jewish. And the nuns mainly went for Mamdani. Most self-identified Jewish voters did not. And yes, you can point to specific instances of Jews for Mamdani. Obviously, many Jews did vote for Mamdani. Most didn't. And that gets kind of tossed aside. And then this whole thing of sensitivities, it seems like, or feeling unsafe became like, once it was Jews who felt unsafe, it's like a joke. You know what I mean? And I just don't feel like there's much consistency from anybody in like, either that's always irrelevant or it's never irrelevant. And there's just something that feels inconsistent, let's say.
There's this thing that you hear all the time now, which is like, well, Jews need to hear some uncomfortable truths, right? Which is like, I actually don't, I think people who say that sort of, again, it's this thing, they say that about globalizing the Intifada, and they say that about how Zionism should be understood. And I think a lot of these people aren't giving Jews enough credit. I think Jewish people are actually capable of hearing uncomfortable truths, but they're not okay with hearing dog whistles about murdering them. I think, having a dialogue with someone where a Palestinian person tells you that Zionism for them has been 75 years of violence and dispossession, that's uncomfortable for me to hear, but I think there's a lot of truth to that, right? Saying globalize the Intifada, wink, wink, is not an uncomfortable truth. It's a dog whistle. And I think we can make those distinctions, and we would ask the same in reverse, right? Where it might be uncomfortable for Palestinians or their allies to hear that anti-Zionism has been anti-Semitism in the experience of Jews for 75 or 100 years.
It's a tricky time because you have like the right has obviously very much embraced large swaths of the right have embraced overt anti-Semitism. And I think that that's so key to kind of understanding the timing of this. And that was why I wrote the column I did, is that like, even if you look at Mamdani and you say, okay, this is not good for Jews, like what's the alternative that's actually there? And that's where what scares me isn't any individual specific actor. It's more like this sort of squeezed out of society from all sides bit.
That is how it feels. And the argument that I've seen from like Blue Sky and like Jew Twitter, people in favor of Mamdani is like, well, he hasn't been great, but we can work with him and he's shown a willingness to work. And I think that that's true, but it's not very inspiring to me. Like, I don't find that to be inspiring or filling me with hope for the future, that it's come to that, or that it seems like the question of whether Jews get to define themselves on their own terms is an open question on the left now, because there, as you said, there is nowhere else to turn. So if we're just kind of in this position of trying to work with someone who we're skeptical of on the left, it doesn't fill me with euphoria or inspiration for the future.
Fair enough. So I want to, because this is a Canadian podcast, and also just because this is not specifically a New York podcast, I'm trying to figure out broader implications. So given how Jewish of a city New York is historically and still demographically, I'm wondering just how much that is going to mean, and just how big of a city New York is and how influential, how much this is going to matter more broadly. So recently, Toronto's own mayor, Olivia Chow, referred to Israel's actions in Gaza as a genocide, which many, but not all Canadian Jews objected to. I'm wondering, like, I don't think that can be like put on Mamdani personally, that wording choice, and I'm not like a big wording choice policer myself, with certain exceptions. Whatever, the point is, do you see Mamdani having, like, what if any impact do you think this is going to have in the North American sphere, or the diaspora, being you are the Diaspora Substacker? What does this mean for the diaspora as opposed to just New York City?
I don't know. I really don't know. I don't want to make predictions about the future. I mean, there have been a whole bunch of, it seems like, primary challengers for congressional races now that are talking about not taking AIPAC money, and seem to be inspired by his campaign win. I mean, I do want to say, I'm not going to make predictions, but I do want to say, I do think there's another reason. There is just an element of this with Mamdani's campaign that it feels like a victory for the pro-Palestine movement in their eyes, I think. But he is a local candidate, and over the past year, the movement has failed to really elect candidates who would work towards changing U.S. policy towards Israel. And it's been a failure in many respects. And I think part of the reason it's been a failure is because of all the things we've been talking about. The purity politics, the unwillingness to listen to Jews who are speaking in good faith. Now, all of that might change, certainly people's attitudes towards Israel are changing. Young people's attitudes are changing for a lot of really legitimate reasons. And I think Jews have a role to play here too. And I think one of the reasons I try to speak is because if the choice is just everyone is an anti-Semite, then people are going to laugh Jewish people out of the room if you see everything as anti-Semitism. So you have to be willing to concede to some truths about Israel's policies in Gaza and the West Bank. And I hope that Jews, progressive Jews, Jews on the left like myself can speak so that we can actually call out real anti-Semitism and moderate people's views on the Israel-Palestine conflict too. I mean, it does disturb me a little bit. I have to say that it's kind of like I've seen a lot of tweets of like from primary campaigns that are like, I don't take corporate money and I don't take AIPAC money. And there's people shouldn't be taking AIPAC money, but it does feel a little weird to me to kind of call that out specifically and especially. I don't know.
No, I see what you're saying. I have one more question that's optimistic. Okay, I want to end on a maybe optimistic note. I don't know. It's like tempered optimism. But it does seem like, and I brought this up also with Emily Tamkin, the last guest on the Jewish angle, but basically like it does seem like anti-woke had been for a while very much aligned with being pro-Israel and sort of opposing the proverbial purple-haired keffiyeh-wearing, that had been kind of the anti-woke kind of Trumpy position, right? But if the new anti-woke is this Groyper anti-Semitic trad thing, will that... So I could see this going one of two ways. And my hopeful view is that this will leave space for lack of a better term, woke or pro-social justice oriented, whatever, spaces to be more welcoming to Jews, if only for this kind of enemy of my enemy reason. And when I see Mamdani being sort of inclusive of, not Israeli Jews, but of New York Jews, I see it as maybe both, votes, but also like, distinguishing himself from the right, from sort of the ascendant kind of Groypery right. Is there any possibility that Jews will sort of count at last on the left if the right stops doing this kind of like, we're getting rid of anti-Semitism, if the right's like, no, we're just embracing anti-Semitism?
That's the hope. I think that the rubber will meet the road when the left encounters a certain kind of Jewish politics that is anything other than the kind of like, if not now, Jewish Voices for Peace kind of politics, which is where I am, which is kind of like Friends of Standing Together politics. Obviously, the left doesn't need to embrace like right-wing fascist Israeli politicians or their supporters, clearly. But I think the right axis to think about this with are Jews who won't necessarily enlist their Jewish identity to either ignore anti-Semitism or use it to speak out against Israel. And that will be the test of the left, really, to see if they can embrace Jews other than that style of Jewish identity politics. And I think it's possible, but I don't know.
Josh Yunis, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Phoebe. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to The Jewish Angle, a podcast from the Canadian Jewish News. This has been Phoebe Maltz Bovy, opinion editor of the CJN and a contributing editor of Scribe Quarterly, the CJN's print magazine. The show is produced and edited by Michael Freeman. Our music is by Frank Freeman. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to The Jewish Angle wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.